think we're ready to begin. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maha Abdelmajid. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Arabic and Near Eastern Languages, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome to AUB today Shidyāq. He's at the University of Marburg in Germany, and I think today he will be taking us on a journey to explore Shidyāq's persistent tendency for list making and enumeration, situating it within a broader concern with language in the Nahda. I believe Dr. Yonge himself has something of a persistent fascination with language. He writes about Arabic philology in the long 19th century, language and affect in postmodern Egyptian literature, but also beyond literature because he discusses matters of political discourse and political chant and analyzes it. And he has also translated a number of literary works from Arabic into German, including works by Miral al-Tahawi, Abdou Khel, and Tawfiq al-Hakim. And I believe the talk he will be giving us today is part of a book that's just been recently published. So, yeah, thank you all for being here today, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Shidyāq.
Thank you very much, Maha, for this kind and introduction. Thank you very much, Bilal and the Sheikh Zayed Chair for Arabic and Islamic Studies and the Department of Arabic and Near Eastern Languages for this kind and generous invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to be today at the AUB and to present today my new book on Shidyāq. My main goal today is to convince you that lists are interesting and important for literary and cultural studies. That enumeration is not necessarily a trivial representational device, but can also be a complex performative device. My paper asks how to do things with lists in Shidyāq's literary text, Shidyāq. While Shidyāq is already known to be a very critical work of the 19th century, I argue that reading lists, that taking enumeration seriously, unveils that Shidyāq's social and cultural criticism is, in many cases, by far more radical than previously thought. In regard to the literary history of enumeration, Shidyāq is an outstanding example because he makes use of the rich enumerative practices in Arab culture and plays with them experimentally. He shows what has been done with word lists and explores what else could be done with word lists in the 19th century. The long 19th century was, according to the global historian Jürgen Osterhammel, a comprehensive transformation of the entire world, a threshold period to what we now vaguely call modernity. This transformation took place in the Ottoman Arab world too, where it is labeled the Nahda. While often translated as Renaissance period, the Nahda could better be described, in my understanding, as an intellectual renewal movement that sought to make sense of and contribute to the ongoing economic, political, social, cultural, and linguistic transformation processes of this time. In books and articles, in speeches and letters, the Nahdawi intellectuals discussed how to achieve the aspired civilizational progress. These discussions may be considered as the social and cultural critiques emanating from the 19th century Arab Nahda. In this context, my study analyzes with Shidyāq's literary masterpiece Shidyāq both a central and eccentric work of the 19th century. It takes up many common questions of the Nahda, but often provides uncommon answers. But let us start in media res in the middle of the story. Paris, 1855. The well-known poet, translator, and philologist Faris Shidyāq publishes in France his literary masterpiece Shidyāq على Shidyāq فيما هو الفرياق أو أيام وشهور وعوام في عجم العرب والعجام. An ambiguous rhyming title brilliantly translated by Humphrey Davis as Leg over Leg, or the turtle in the tree, concerning the Shidyāq, what manner of creature might he be? Otherwise entitled Days, Months, and Years, spent in critical examination of the Arabs and their non-Arab peers. Shidyāq was born around 1805, 1806 in Lebanon to a Maronite family. He converted to Protestantism, consequently fled to Egypt and Malta, moved to England and came to Paris in 1855, stayed here until 1853 in order to make a living with the Arabic language. Although he was warmly welcomed by the French press, he failed to secure a reasonable post and earned his living in precarious conditions. In this time he wrote Shidyāq, a hybrid texture woven out of narration, reflection, and enumeration. It tells a story of the protagonist Al-Shidyāq, a concoction of the name Faris and Shidyāq, who lived, like his author did, in Lebanon, Malta, Egypt, England, and France. He is married to Al-Faryaqiyya, literally translated the Shidyāq-like wife, who soon becomes an emancipated and sharp-witted critic like her husband. She is, as Jeffrey Roper says, the antithesis of the conventional stereotype of the submissive and downtrodden Oriental woman. The protagonists experience and discuss the customs and manners of Arabs and their non-Arab peers, as the subtitle says. The self-conscious narrator, for his part, often interrupts the narration with his own reflections on Arabs and non-Arabs. In addition, and this is important for tonight, lexical enumeration is intrinsically interwoven with narration and reflection. Published in 1855, the book was immediately widely advertised throughout Europe, where it incited a brief but severe scandal. It is a work that would be worthy of Voltaire, wrote the French Catholic newspaper L'Ami de la Religion in 1858 in full disdain. It is this kind of cynicism in religion, in morals, and politics. Finally, L'Ami de la Religion calls on France to stop the distribution of this book. In the Arab readership, it incited a long-lasting but rather smoldering scandal, I would say. Many intellectuals criticized Shidyāq rather clandestinely in letters and articles for its assumed religious disparagement or moral licentiousness. Most of contemporary Arab and European intellectuals, however, agreed that Shidyāq is an outstanding linguistic achievement. In the latter phase of his life, Shidyāq turned into an influential public intellectual and famous lexicographer. He converted to Islam, founded in Istanbul the Arabic newspaper Al-Jawā'ib that circulated widely in the Arab world and beyond. He also published his important lexicographical works, Sir al-Layal fi Qalb wal-Ibdal, The Secrets of the Night on Metathesis and Substitution, and Al-Jazus ala al-Qamus, Spying on the Dictionary, and edited Ibn Manzur's dictionary Lisan al-Arab. He died in 1887 as a well-known protagonist of the Nahda, who lived most of his lifetime outside the Arab world, but found his true homeland in the Arabic language. My approach to Shidyāq shifts the analytical focus from narration to enumeration, from story to list. In literary history, Nahdawi prose in general and Shidyāq in particular have often been reduced to the genre of the novel. And Shidyāq is called a precursor of the novel or even the first Arabic novel. In such a reading, enumeration of words and philological discussions are considered to be linguistic digressions, so much so that the 5th edition of Shidyāq in 1982 even bowdlerized these assumingly old-fashioned word lists in order to unveil, as it says, the modernity of the text. My student, by contrast, seeks to unveil the latent relevance or possible modernity, to reuse a term of Farad wa Ashur, of precisely these assumingly old-fashioned lists. In this regard, word lists become trials of Arab modernity, to use a related term of Tariq el-Aris. Within the Nahda studies, this approach is part of a recent return to philology, as Edward Said has elaborated on it, in order to understand language as crucial producer of political and social reality. This return to philology in literary and cultural study means to consider both language and philology of the 19th century Nahda as crucial discourse makers. In regard to recent research on Shidyāq's Asaq, I follow here studies by Shabel Dere, Nadia al-Baghdadi, Kaman Rastegar, Wenjin Ouyang, Jeffrey Sachs, Tariq Al-Haris, Nadia Bouali, and Rana Isa, who all elaborate on different aspects of language, philology, and Nahda discourse. In this field, my study seeks to add the practice of lists as cultural politics. In literary studies, my approach challenges the centrality of the novel and narrativity. It thereby follows, at least in parts, studies by Radwa Ashur, Kaman Rastegar, Boutros Halak, Rebecca Johnson, and Barbara Winkler, but emphasizes the aesthetic of word lists. Thus, my study is less interested in the narrative art, or Erzählkunst in German, but in the verbal art, or Wortkunst, to use two terms of Wolf Schmid. According to Schmid, verbal arts emphasize not so much the referential function of language, that is representation, but what Roman Jakobson has called the poetic function of language, the aesthetical self-referentiality of language, when language becomes a message for its own sake. This kind of literature foregrounds what Roland Barthes has called a literary meta-language, a literature that makes its own language to its object of interest and reflects on its own language thinking, or Sprachdenken in German, a term used by Jürgen Trabant, for all our conceptual thinking of language and how these concepts of language shape our thinking. With my literary and cultural approach, I'm therefore mainly interested in the self-referential and discursive functions of language in Asaq. To put it in a nutshell, my approach is reading language. This is in line with the historical function of early Nahda literature in general and Asaq in particular. In the foreword, Shidyāq claims that Asaq has two concerns. First, quote, to expose the oddities of the Arabic language, including its rare words. And second, quote, to discuss the praiseworthy and blameworthy qualities of women, including the many huruf nisa'iyya, the words related to women, that the protagonist Al-Faryaq is so eager to collect. Moreover, the narrator claims that he has selected all the precious words exclusively from Al-Firuz Abadi's post-classical dictionary Al-Qasmus Al-Muhit, the Comprehensive Ocean, so that Asaq becomes a literary digest of Al-Qamus Al-Muhit. Enumeration is an important device in Asaq. Some 250 out of 750 pages are enumerations, like horizontal enumerations in the matan or running text, or, for the first time in Arabic book culture, vertical enumeration in form of columns or lists, and also enumeration at the margins. Enumeration is also a crucial but often neglected device of Arabic literature in general. Here you see a mocking list by At-Tahidi from the 11th century, and a sound list in a poem by Nasif al-Yaziji from the 19th century, and a list of fear in Ahmed al-Ayyidi's contemporary pop novel. According to Sabine Meinberger, enumeration is a fragmented language, and all elements of a list are by definition decontextualized. But what does this mean? The various words are taken out of their various contexts. They are decontextualized and often desemanticized and put together on a list. The list's frame, however, recontextualizes these elements. Literature often allows for enumerative games, as Meinberger says, when it offers more than one frame, more than one recontextualization and resemantization. To give you an example from Asaq, reflecting on the relationship between music and religion, the narrator describes the sound of the organ in the Catholic Church as follows. Tantana wa dandana wa khankhana wa damdama wa salsala wa jaljala wa zakzaka wa bakbaka wa taktaka wa ratamtama wa rakrak wa rikrik wa shapeshape wa mimi wa tirtir. This onomatopoetic enumeration, this writing aloud, can first be understood as the acoustic description of the organ. Second, it can also be understood as a celebration of music in religion. Third, it performs Arabic as music. Fourth, the narrator shows off his lexical skills. Fifth, he unveils the lexical richness of Arabic in regard to sound. Sixth, it foregrounds Shidyāq's etymological theory claiming that language is historically born out of sound. Enumeration is here verbal art that refers to language and how language makes the world. In a seminal study, Fawaz Tarabulsi and Aziz Al-Azma said that Shidyāq stripped the Arabic language naked, exposed the language. Ara Shidyāq al-Lugha al-Arabiyya. Picking up this notion, my study develops the exposure of words into an analytical term for a textual device which has, at times, epistemic, aesthetic, affective, or erotic functions. It's كشف عن الكلمات and إبرازها وفتحها وتعاريتها. By this exposure of words, my study analyzes how Shidyāq exposes the words of the Arabic language and how these words expose the contemporary world. But many of the enumerated words in Shidyāq are rather arcane, rare and archaic words. Words like qarabiq, khajawjad, shanzara, and so on. And I will later come back to these words. How can these words refer to or represent the 19th century? In his factual travelogue, Kashf al-Mukhabba an Funun Europa, Unveiling the Hidden in the Arts of Europe, Shidyāq describes the urban landscapes of Paris with an enumeration of figures counting, for instance, 21 boulevards and 183 shopping passages in Paris, thereby using French loanwords like boulevard and passage. In Shidyāq, in contrast, the protagonist describes the Parisian commercials, for instance, with Persian loanwords like karabij, qarabij, qarabiq, that show no cultural relation to the urban space of 19th century Paris. These and many other words in Shidyāq's lists do not represent the contemporary 19th century world or Paris, but rather the enumeration of these words perform a negotiation of the contemporary world. They are a trial of Arab modernity. To read the performative function, the frame is important. That means the recontextualization of words, here highlighted in blue. In this way, the protagonist uses enumeраtive lengths to show that empowered women are working everywhere in the public space in Paris, not only in a boulevard or passage, but in 25 locations in the plural. It may also show that 19th century Paris is for the protagonist as strange as the words qarabij, qarabiq, and qarabij. In this and other enumeраtive performances, archaic words can express modern sentiments. My study focuses on enumeration as a performative device and discusses how classical words can be turned into a social and cultural critique of the 19th century. In particular, I discuss the topics of gender, pleasure, and language. Gender is, of course, one of the main debates of the 19th century Nahda. Within the discourse of civilization, the aspired progress is closely linked to the emancipation of women. In his seminal speech on the education of women in Beirut, Boutros al-Bustani demanded that women should receive education in order to become valuable members of the family and society. And Shidyāq described in his new paper Al-Jawā'ib in the 1860s the negative psychological effects of gender segregation. While these debates were in the beginning male debates about women's rights, as Dagmar Glass says, from the 1870s, women like Mariana Fathallah Marash started to speak for themselves and criticized the blind gaps in the male discourse, what she calls beauty spots. Shidyāq takes part in the male proto-feminist discourse, but partly deconstructs it from within. In regard to gender segregation, for instance, the protagonist claims that it does not only harm women, but also men. In a segregated family, for instance, the father has no contact with his children. He is therefore deprived of joy. You do not tunadir your child or taram him. You do not tunarrir him or tarhum him. Like ra'ima and rachama, many lexicographical word explanations do not refer to the fatherly, but rather to the motherly role. According the common classical usage, as for instance attested in As-Sa'alabi's Fiqh al-Lugha, the words ra'ima refers to a she-camel and means, here in the definition of Firuzabadi's Al-Qamus, she displayed affection for her child and stayed close by it. By detaching words from their proper context and transferring them into a new context, Shidyāq makes use of these words for camels and women to articulate a Nahdawi gender reform for men. The de- and recontextualization of words in enumeration performs an act of lexical deterritorialization, as one can say in line with Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. A deterritorialization is a transgression of a given regime of signs, thereby seeking to create new ways of signification. Here, this creates not new lexical denotation, but a new cultural connotation. By way of this connotative deterritorialization, classical words of female childcare can become words for a Nahdawi fatherly childcare, connotations for a new father. While Al-Bustani demanded a new mother in his speech, Shidyāq's claim for a new father is rather unique, or let's say radical, in the Nahda discourse. It is part of his far-reaching reformist ideas of fundamentally reshaping male gender roles. In regard to female gender roles, he has an egalitarian approach that even goes so far as to criticize the Arabic language for its gendered beauty spots, to channel Madiana Marash. He exposes the relation between patriarchy and language. Al-Faryaqiyya is a sharp-witted critic and language thinker who scrutinizes the words of women that her husband collects, words like taba'alat, which means, according to Al-Qamus, the woman who has obeyed her Ba'al or husband, and she puts her finery on for him. For Al-Faryaqiyya, such words are the product of the complicity between patriarchy and lexicography. Since Arabic is exclusively compiled by men, she says, dictionaries can only contain words expressing male needs. If women would have compiled them, they would have coined and compiled different words. Words expressing the needs of women. Words like, enumeration, men who only think of their wives, and how men should avert their glances from all but these, and so on and so forth. This inventory of gendered blind spots is a mapping of lexical gaps that unveils the dictionaries are, in feminist terms, phallogocentric products where the act of signification is dominated by the male, and language is put in the service of the patriarchate. Indeed, while classical Arabic literature has some quite famous female poets, classical Arabic lexicography does not have, to the best of my knowledge, a well-known female lexicographer. Nevertheless, Al-Faryaqiyya can express her male need by making use of lexical ambiguities and enumerative deterritorialization. Radwa Ashur called Al-Faryaqiyya the first feminist character in modern Arabic literature. Although she is not possible to publish by her own, she is, I argue, a kind of utopian new woman of the Nahda who performs orally an écriture féminine, as Hélène Cixous has elaborated on it, a female reappropriation of male language and signification. Shidyāq can be called a male proto-feminist. While he fervently fought for equality feminism in Shidyāq and later also in Al-Jawā'ib, he developed with Shidyāq also a Nahdawi vision of radical difference feminism. If women receive the same education as men, how differently would they use the Arabic language? And in consequence, which different critique would they be able to voice? In Shidyāq, Al-Faryaqiyya is a utopian Nahdawi woman that turns her husband into a new man. In Shidyāq, the man needs the radical critique of the new Nahdawi woman to become himself a new Nahdawi man. Unlike gender, pleasure is not an obvious topic of the 19th century, since it was widely problematized, and especially in the circles of the cultural Puritans of the Levant. In these debates, bodily pleasure, including erotic and sexual pleasure, was believed to be inferior to the intellectual and spiritual pleasures, since the latter express a disciplined reason. At a second glance, however, pleasure for its own sake was acknowledged as an important drive to gain more and more knowledge, as Cornelius van Dijk argued in في لذة العلم وفوائدها, the pleasures of knowledge and the virtues of pleasure. However, the use of pleasure, to employ the expression of Michel Foucault, was restricted to civilizational goals, like achieving or gaining scientific knowledge, while the pleasure of philological knowledge became sometimes problematized, as in al-Bustani's speech on the arts of the Arab in 1859, which can be, to some extent, be read as an answer to Shidyāq. On the contrary, Shidyāq was an ardent lover of the classical Arabic language who defended linguistic pleasures and combined it with sexual pleasures. Shidyāq in particular deals with the pleasures of words and women and celebrates an eroticism of the signifier and the signified. In Shidyāq performs a kind of affective philology of the senses that eventually uses affective linguistic pleasures for Nahdawi goals. When Al-Shidyāq comes to Alexandria, he witnesses the charms of veiled women flirting with men. She bewitches them, her expressive looks and glances, her come-hither wings and co-eyes, and so on and so forth, in an enumeration of 166 words. This lexicographically driven enumeration is less about what the protagonist has really witnessed. By mapping the rich Arabic lexis for flirtation, it becomes an epistemological enumeration highlighting what the protagonist could possibly know through the Arabic language and express with the Arabic words. It exposes intellectually the linguistic abundance and epistemological richness of words. At the same time, it effectively celebrates the beauty of these words by arranging them into an artful, rhymed and rhythmic prose or saj'a. بِرَمْزِهَا وَلَمْزِهَا وَهَجْلِهَا وَغَمْزِهَا, and so on and so forth. This effective lexicography first eroticizes the words or signifiers, the beauty of our language, as the narrator says, so that the reader is more affected by and therefore more interested in the Arabic language. Second, it eroticizes the women, or the signified by unveiling the charms of veiled women. This foregrounds the importance of corporeal pleasure in everyday life, a major topic in Shidyāq's social and cultural critique. When the couple lives in Victorian England, Al-Shidyāq criticizes the misery of the English lower class that contradicts all claims of Britain being a progressive and civilized country. In the context of a rampant capitalism, ordinary people live here only for their work, for a work that can hardly feed them. They have no time and no capacity for social companionship. And she ends her philosophical reflections by claiming that life is not to be valued by observing instruments and machines. Rather, its value lies in seizing the convivial moments with those who are dear, keeping company with persons of culture of whom one thinks with pleasure, whether they be elsewhere or here. The world's worth lies in exchanging beaux mots. And here starts a matrimonial dialogue with a rhymed enumeration that I will read in Arabic. قالت إنما الدنيا مفاكهة فقلت ومناكهة قالت ومطارحة قلت ومشارحة قالت ومجارزة قلت ومراهزة قالت ومداعبة قلت ومزعبة وهنا ختام الملاعبة. This enumerative saj'a textually performs what Al-Shidyāq actually claims to be values of human life, speaking and jesting together in social communities. The intellectual exchange between men and women on equal footing, which turns this affective dialogue into a verbal foreplay between the spouses. It is precisely the elaborated use of Arabic language that enables here the pleasures of life. Interestingly, all the rhyme words following the mufa'ala pattern are form in Arabic that expresses reciprocity to do something in relation with someone. These words embody the affective dimension of heterosocial companionship. The pleasure of language provides here a kind of savoir-vivre, resisting the sometimes brutal imperative of economic and social modernization. According to Shidyāq, the Arabic language holds a deep knowledge of what philosophy calls the good life. Moreover, Shidyāq celebrates to get lost in pleasures, or to be more precisely, to get lost in linguistic and erotic pleasures. Like in the affective dialogue, it turns from the comfortable and disciplined plaisir to the sometimes uncomfortable and undisciplined jouissance, to use Roland Barthes' distinction. It celebrates the affective loss of control, reason, and sovereignty in order to be affected by and exposed to what really matters in life. As a result, Shidyāq's social and cultural critique makes use of an affective reasoning which is in the Nakhta rather eccentric and radical. Since this includes the exposure of erotic and sexual words, Shidyāq was fervently criticized by his contemporaries for words that, quote, embarrass a young man, let alone a young woman, as voiced by the public intellectual Georgi Zaidan. My last topic, language, is very central to the Nakhta discourse because the perceived need for linguistic renewal was tied to Arabic as key constituent of the Arab community and identity. In his speech on the arts of the Arab, al-Bustani described the Arabic language as a wild field of reform. In former times, the old Bedouin Arabs were eager to describe every detail of the camel, so that the classical Arabic language now holds more names for the camel than the camel has actually hairs, he says. At the same time, however, Arabic lacked many terms for technical inventions and civilizational matters. But what then is the use of these old expressions, al-Bustani asked rhetorically, for a modern civilization that replaces the service of camel with that of railway wagons? Shidyāq, by contrast, argues that Arab civilization historically is not built on technological inventions, but first and foremost on language. While Shidyāq later in Al-Jawā'ib coined many modern words, including Ishtirakiyya for socialism, he collected in Shidyāq the classical words in order to unveil the possible modernity of the classical Arabic language. In Shidyāq, enumeration exposes words for the reader by lexical explaining and cultural interpreting them, but also, and very often, enumeration also exposes the reader to words without explaining and interpreting them, but rather forcing the reader to make sense of them. This refers, for instance, to synonyms. In line with Ibn Faris and other lexicographers, Shidyāq claims that the Arabic has no total synonyms. Even supposed synonyms like khajuj and khajawjat meaning a wind passes violently and a wind passes violently and constantly have different shades of meaning. The old Arabs, according to Shidyāq, coined for every specific thing a unique word, but due to the historical distance, we, in the 19th century, are no longer aware of these lexical differences. Unlike the lexicographical Furuq words, Shidyāq does not explain these differences, but wants the reader to meditate on synonyms like zamjara, huffing and puffing. Therefore, he brings words like shanzara, shansara, and shandhara together, and thereby suggesting them to be an ibdal triplet, that is, words that are made by the linguistic substitution of letters and have, according to Shidyāq, a similar yet slightly different meaning. According to Abu Tayyib al-Lughawi, the letter za and sod are typical ibdal letters, while the is rarely one. Shidyāq does not deal with these subtleties explicitly, but rather exposes the words to the reader so that they discover them by themselves. Other enumerative juxtapositions expose, for instance, Shidyāq's theory of the proper meaning of a letter in words, a theory already prefigured by Ibn Jinni, or the B-radicality of Arabic words, as developed in Shidyāq's lexicographical work Sir al-Layal. When writing Shidyāq in the 1850s, Shidyāq was already working on his later published lexicographical works. Indeed, Shidyāq includes these theories only implicitly, since he doesn't explain them explicitly here. Shidyāq does not argue for them lexicographically or philologically, but rather stages or performs these theories literarily and aesthetically. By bringing different words together in one enumeration, putting them together, Shidyāq recontextualizes these words experimentally. These assemblages, to use a concept by Deleuze and Guattari, suggest flexible semantic relationships or subtle lexical differences, evoking etymological origins or possible ambiguities. They force the reader to think about and to think through the language, to ruminate on the contemporary world through classical words. By mapping the rich lexis of Huruf Nisa'iyya, the text is an invitation to rethink the role of women through the words related to women. In classical Arabic language thinking, for instance, in the case of Ibn Faris, lexical richness was a matter of pride for the Arab community, an idea that Shidyāq explicitly defends in Shidyāq. With this linguistic cultural concept in mind, mapping the words of women means to expose the importance of women to Arab society. And Shidyāq is very explicit about this argument. For instance, after compiling some 40 words for big-buttocked women, the narrator satirically exclaims, "Does His Honor our Lord, the most excellent judge, our venerated Emir, have half as many names and sobriquets as these women?" A further example is a list with more than 200 words for women that you can see here, but you cannot. So it's basically 20 pages of enumerations. This list performs, in the words of Umberto Eco, an enumerative infinity. It makes the reader feel that this list is never ending. And by so doing, it makes a statement on the crucial importance of women to Arab culture. Women are infinitely important because they have infinitive words. In this sense, Shidyāq functions as a lexical archive carrying a cultural memory for an imagined contemporary community. In the terms of Aleida Assmann, Shidyāq is both a storage archive that stores the words in order to be not forgotten, and a functional archive that gives these words a new function for society. But did Shidyāq, a storage archive, really save these words from oblivion? Interestingly, many dictionaries of the 19th century, like those of Al-Bustani and Ash-Shatuni, did transmit Shidyāq's word, even the often problematized erotic and sexual words, as you can see in this schedule or chart. Yep. Most of the words appear in the dictionaries of the 19th century, but then got lost in the 20th century and are absent, or mostly absent, from Al-Munjid in the latest edition that was published in 2001. Based on these findings, one can see that there is no radical lexical rupture in the 19th century Nahda, as sometimes claimed. What makes Shidyāq unique, therefore, is not the storing of these words, but their selection, making them visible, and recontextualizing and re-semanticizing them. Using Al-Bustani's expression, one could say that Shidyāq used the words for camels to describe the era of the railway. This provokes, using the term of Viktor Shklovsky, a defamiliarization both of the classical Arabic words and the contemporary modern world. As a functional archive, Shidyāq offers a fresh insight both into pre-modern language and contemporary modernity. At the end of my presentation, I would love to come back to Paris. Shidyāq's radical and experimental critique has to be contextualized not only in the Nahdawi discourse of Beirut, but also in the Orientalism of the French Société Asiatique and Dussacy's European influence. To be more precise, Shidyāq is also product of the philological encounters between European and Levantine scholars and their entangled history of 19th century European Ottoman Arab Orientalism. Many of the linguistic discussions of the Nakhta are interlinked with Orientalist debates. In regard to synonyms, for instance, Heinrich Leberecht Fleischer, a German student of de Sacy, criticized the Arabic predilection for synonyms and immediately applauded al-Bustani for breaking with this vein for Dilal al-Arab, as he says. Likewise, Fleischer described the old Arabic of Sa'alabi's Fiqh al-Lugha as a language without any civilization, describing it in an exoticizing way, quote, as a tropical jungle with all its beauty, but also with all its wilderness and horniness. Geilheit in German. In his opinion, Arabic language and literature has to free itself from the old Arabic in order to serve the needs of civilizational progress. Against this and other misgivings concerning the classical Arabic language, Shidyāq exposed and celebrated the possible relevance and social and cultural modernity of the classical language. The main battlefields of these encounters, however, were the genre of the maqama in general and al-Hariri's maqamat in particular. In the supplement to Shidyāq, Shidyāq sought to refute the linguistic and philological supremacy of European Orientalism. Alexandre Schotzko, for instance, stated chauvinistically that European scholars know much more about Oriental languages than the Arab, Persian, and Indian scholars. In order to destroy this claim, Shidyāq penned an inhumative polemic exposing the linguistic faults of Sylvestre de Sacy, the figurehead of contemporary Orientalism. In the so-called appendix to the book, in which are strung together the pearl-like errors made by the great masters among the teachers of the Arabic languages in the school of Paris, he listed up all linguistic and philological faults made by de Sacy in the commentary of his edition of Hariri's Maqamat, edited between 1822 and 23. However, he is not the first to do so, because the Lebanese man of letters Nassif al-Yazigi already wrote in 1833 a philological critique that was published in 1848 in German by August Ferdinand von Mehren. While al-Yazigi explained the faults in prose paragraphs, Shidyāq transformed them into the fragmented language of lists, repeating his main message: wrong, 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 wrong. For Walter Benjamin, polemics means to repeat an accusation so often that it turns into a deadly weapon. Inhumative philology in the form of endless vertical lists is polemical philology. This list seeks to destroy the assumed linguistic supremacy of Orientalists and their prerogative of interpretation. It is not for the European Orientalists to decide what is relevant and modern in Arabic language and what is not. Publishing Shidyāq with Benjamin Duprat, publisher of the Société Asiatique, Shidyāq scored a big coup. He published a book with the Société Asiatique against the Société Asiatique. Moreover, because he published it with Duprat, it gained the cultural capital, to say with Bourdieu, of the Société Asiatique. As the aforementioned French newspaper L'Ami de la Religion stated, people in the Arab world are buying Shidyāq because the cover refers explicitly to the Société Asiatique. In the context of the 19th century, Shidyāq is a rather unique product because it epitomizes a spatio-temporal autonomy of the author Shidyāq in Paris in 1855. The author claims, or fashions himself, to have total control over his book. That is the exclusive prerogative to express his critical observations. By contrast, al-Yazigi's critique, published in 1848 in Leipzig, was framed by a Latin commentary of the editor van Meeren, which was twice as long as al-Yazigi's Arabic critique, and thereby performed an Orientalist supremacy over Arabic philology. Shidyāq's autonomy, however, was precarious. Though Shidyāq was less unknown, majhul, in its time, it was consequently made unknown, mujahal, as Trabulsi and Al-Azm say. Moreover, The later Muslim intellectual Shidyāq in Istanbul neither wrote a sequel as promised in Shidyāq, nor did he republish Shidyāq in his publishing house Al-Jawā'ib, as he did with so many other of his works. Thus, Shidyāq epitomizes the precarious autonomy of a Nahdawi author to express an experimental and radical critique of society and culture. It exposes the vulnerability of critics and their critique in the Nahda. To conclude, Shidyāq's literary lists in Shidyāq convey a radical and experimental critique of contemporary 19th century culture and society. By compiling classical words, it exposes their possible modernity to the contemporary world, that is, their possible societal and cultural relevance. In my definition, the device of exposing words foregrounds the metalinguistic and aesthetic self-referentiality of words in the literary text. Through this device, the signifier does not disappear behind the signified, but becomes gradually the message for its own sake. However, Shidyāq does not unveil the essence of the Arabic language as such, nor its entire lexis. Rather, it carefully selects words, meaning, and collocations. It creates a modern lens on the Arabic language as much as it reads modernity through the classical language. In its selective and playful way, it's more interested in making the future than assessing the past. In this sense, it's a future philology, as a literary philosophical philology of Friedrich Nietzsche has been called, a way of returning the philology of words into a stage for making the world. Shidyāq's future philology often takes up common questions of the Nahda, but often proposes also new answers through its reading of classical Arabic language. It demands radical new roles for men and women that transcend the educational emancipation project of the Nahda. It also develops a body anthropology where bodily knowledge is of same value as intellectual knowledge, and it relies on a model of civilization where the Arabic language offers an epistemology for modernity. Finally, it refutes the assumed philologist supremacy of Orientalism and its prerogative of cultural interpretation. On a more general level, and here I conclude, I would like to summarize the approaches of my book, or the readings, in a list, of course. Reading beyond the novel. Nahda prose literature should not be reduced to a reading of narratives and a reading of proto-novels. Rather, Nahda prose literature is much more hybrid, and in the case of Shidyāq, contains essayistic reflections and lexicographical enumerations. Second, reading enumeration. Enumeration is a crucial but often neglected device in classical and modern Arabic language and lexicography. Literary and cultural studies have ample material in Arabic culture to explore the epistemic and aesthetic functions of this small but important textual form. Third, reading language. Given the centrality of language to Arabic culture, to use a title by Bilal Orfali, literary and cultural studies have abundant material to study the Arabic literary meta-language, the linguistic autopoiesis of Arabic texts, and their discursive functions. This is the end of enumeration. This is the end of presentation. Thank you very much for your concentration.
I was really hoping for rhymed prose in the end, and you did it, so thank you for that.
Yes.
Okay, I think we're gonna open the floor directly for questions. Yeah, and I think we're gonna begin maybe with Dr. Radlaki. If you have a question.
Okay.
Yeah, of course. Please go ahead. No.
Thank
Your
you for
guest.
a very informative lecture. Actually, you concentrated or you focused on Shidyāq ala Shidyāq. That was very informative. And as you well know, these lists have their origin in the 3rd century of Hijrah, with words like the Qutaybas and Father Kitabiyya, after the Hamadani, or Qura al-Naman. So we have them. So they're not totally new, but the way they are presented by Ahmed Shidyāq is innovative. Now, I want to throw an idea concerning Jesus al-Qamus and Sir al-Mayan rather than Shidyāq al-Shidyāq. I think these books, the purely linguistic books, are also lists in their own right. Anyway, every dictionary, every lexicon is a list of words. But In particular, in Asaq, you have lists of words which are biconsonantal. So if you take qaf, ta, and the third radical, qata'a, qatafa, qatama, qatasha, they all indicate cutting. If you take nun and ba, naba'a, naba'a, nabagha, nabara, they indicate eruption. If you gather all these words in Jasus, you come up with a beautiful list of which captures the spirit of Arabic according to Shidyāq of biconsonantalism. Whether the theory is true or not is a different story. I don't know whether you agree with this idea.
Totally, and I found it very interesting. Well, I come from literary studies, so I was not interested in dictionaries. Unlike then I started reading Asaq, and I couldn't make sense out of it. And more I had to deal with dictionaries and with the whole lexicographical heritage or these enumerative practices. And I would totally agree, especially concerning Sir al-Layal and al-Jasus. Many of, for instance, there's what I want to say is there is enumeration is so important, and oh, okay, I'm lost. But the list, for instance, that I first read out, this onomatopoetic list, is also in Sir al-Layal, and it's even longer there, and it's used for this argument of that sound is the origin of language. So many lists that we find in Asaq, we can find them in one way or another in the lexicographical words. So this reading together is very important, and also, as I tried to say, to understand Asaq as a way of performing them aesthetically and literarily, while later arguing for them in a more lexicographical way. Nevertheless, of course, this practice is omnipresent in Shidyāq's work, and I think we have to study them from both sides. From an aesthetical side, that is often there, because this is also part of the argument of the beauty of the language and the epistemological richness, and also, of course, to include the rich, abundant lexicographical material to that they relate, starting as early as Kitab al-Gharib and so on. Yeah, I would totally agree.
Other questions? Dr. Isa?
Thank you very much, Christian. I wish your entire book is in English. I only know a small article of it. I wanted to ask you about how do you think, so if we were to think of enumeration, how is that going to push us to think differently about the novel? So the novel, Shidyāq, Saq al-Asaq, but also in general the novel. Can we theorize the novel from enumeration, and vice versa? Can the novel help us understand lexicography?
You could, well, yes, perhaps it helps us to pose a question differently. Not how enumeration helps us to reevaluate or reapproach the novel, but to understand the literary prose text, not by the genre of the novel. By this I mean it helps us to move away from narrativity as the main interest that we have in a literary prose text. Especially when I came across Asaq, I was also interested in this kind of essayistic reflection that is in the text that somehow undermines the narrativity. And it's often said, of course, this is pre-major because it's still too essayistic, still too much about this self-conscious narrator who interrupts the story, and so on and so forth. So it may help us to understand literary prose texts as structures or textures that are not necessarily to be evaluated or approached through the lens of the novel. So it might help us to shed light on structures more, microstructures, macrostructures of texts than novel and as a genre. So perhaps it might help us to somehow to move away from the novel itself and to approach pure novels by asking more about textual structures, and as a second part to include essayistic words essayistic words, essays, more into literature, into prose literature, because I feel that is, at least, I don't know, in European approaches to Arabic literature, there are not many who really take essays as part of prose literature and study them really as novels. And for instance, Ilyas Khouri had a wonderful article in Jadaliyya on the letter Nun. And what he did is, you could say in some way or another, what Shidyāq did, it's this playful thinking with lexical ideas, putting them together, making connections, associations. This is perhaps what he take more into account and to understand the literariness of non-narrative text. Interestingly also that, I would argue at least, that Sartre, which of course narrative or Sardeya as narrativity or narratology, is in Lisan al-Arab, the term for Sartre al-Alfaz means to enumerate words. So we might even rethink Sartre in a wider concept as a kind of structure, as a literary structure for text rather than narrativity, as we understand it today. So in this way, perhaps we might, without of course arguing against the importance of the novel, but just to decentralize somehow the importance of the novel that overshadows other forms of prose literature.
Other questions?
Thank you for the talk. A more practical question. Do we know how many copies were there printed of the book when it got first printed in 55? And where did you find the references of the reactions of people? Come back to that.
Unfortunately, we do not know how many copies. We do know how they are well, we do not. We know, we have hints how they are distributed, because Benjamin Duprat was quite well connected to other European booksellers. So we have, as I have shown you, these. I will scroll back. This announcement of the book, and we know how much it cost, and we know somehow how they advertised it. As for instance, saying des curieuses remarques sur nos savants de l'Europe. So we have these informations. We have in 1856 a review of the Deutsche Morgenländische Gesellschaft, the German Oriental Society, because Shidyāq himself sent a copy to the German Oriental Society, and this was reviewed. This is quite an interesting review. And in 1858, the L'Ami de la Religion wrote this kind of satirical, or well, this calling Shidyāq a work that would be worse of Voltaire. Of course, me from a Catholic point of view, this is it's heretical. It's a catastrophe. So interestingly, and this article was also republished in a German newspaper, in a quite at this time quite a famous newspaper, Augsburger Postzeitung, where it also reiterated the call for France to stop the distribution, because apparently at that time Shidyāq traveled. The copies of Shidyāq traveled really to the Arab world. We know that his brother. Shidyāq's brother read the book, at least parts of it. We know that in 1859, Boutros al-Bustani read the book because he, later in Qissat Asad al-Shidyāq, he quoted from the book without mentioning it. And I would say even his speech on the arts of the Arab is in some way, there are some hints that this is a kind of replique to Shidyāq's Shidyāq. Every here and there we have bits, or at least that what I have found. Rizq al-Hassoun has in his translation and a part of his poem, he has a part where he has written a very polemical piece on Shidyāq and on Shidyāq. We have later articles on synonyms that also deal with Shidyāq. Arabic one in Al-Muqtataf. But these are not, at least not like in L'Ami de la Religion, these are not as visible. This critique was there, and it was voiced, but it was also somehow more carefully, I don't know. Because, might be, because also Shidyāq was a feared polemicist. I mean, he was polemicizing against Al-Bustani and Ibrahim al-Yazigi in a way that is shocking to us today, I would say, at least. It's very, very outspoken.
Could it be because of the translation of the Bible, maybe? Because they were doing it at the same time.
No, this controversy was about actually about Majma' al-Bahrain, the Maqamat collection of Nasif al-Yazigi, and Shidyāq said, no, it's Fitahal and not Fithal, and this is a fault, and then on this Zaman al-Fitahal. And this should based on this, a whole debate evolved about, about the approaches to language and so on.
And this debate, when did it start? Because I always 71. Then later on.
Yeah, it was later.
Then he had the grudge, maybe. I mean, for it to be that violent in the language, maybe it's because I'm also always wondering how come his version of the Bible, the one he did with Samuel Lee, was never really used, and it was the second one, the one with Cornelius van Dyke. Was it a problem of the Americans coming later on, and them, and because he changed religions, all these things?
Well, I'm not an expert in this. I would,
You should
if
just turn around and ask Rana, I think.
besobt,
We
I-
have
You
Because,
have the slides as well.
that is not my field of expertise.
More questions? Other questions? If not, I think I'm gonna ask you maybe. So maybe it's an attempt to detour back to Rana's question, and maybe I'll do it in like 2 steps, right? So if I were to say that I want to hear more about sort of that shift to focusing on the performative, right? And how you think it's related to a question of new philology. And we know like Said is very much about representation, right? So we have that kind of new philology and performance, so what's happening there. And then the other thing is also my attempt to go back to Rana, is like, okay, if you were to think a little bit more abstractly about questions of the performative and representation, because he talks a lot about signification, how might these two be brought together? And I think if these two could be thought next to each other, then we could return once again to the question of the novel and the essay in perhaps a way that dissolves this dichotomy a little bit. So let's just...
That's a good one. I think, what I think the interesting point is that it's negotiation, or we might call it these trials of Arab modernity, as Tariq Al-Aris did, that dealing with words that are not directly representing, for instance, the women of Alexandria or the urban landscape of Paris, is interesting because it relates back in an indirect way to questions related to the female presence in public sphere in Paris, or the behavior of women, and so on and so forth. So I'm interested in in this kind of performance, what does it mean dealing with these words, putting words together, and how could they, in a given frame, negotiate something that is not directly linked to the meaning of these words, but nevertheless, by putting together, by selecting, first selecting the context, then putting together on a list, then be framed in a certain text that is narrating on the 19th century. What does this make? How does this negotiate the 19th century? And of course, one could ask, perhaps enumeration and storing together, selecting, putting together and reframing is, in a very wide sense, one of the ambitions of the Nahda. So to putting different things together, to store them, to make encyclopedias, to make dictionaries, to put new knowledge together, to bring knowledge in a different frame, and so on and so forth. Even if we expand this idea, we might perhaps have this kind of this goes, of course, in a kind of cultural, archival approach to Nahda, to the negotiation of given facts or materials that is reused in a new frame. So perhaps this might then relate to an understanding of Nahda.
Other questions? There are no other questions, then we'll just give you a rest. Thank you so much. Thank you again, Christian.
Thank you so much.